This debate is the debate that should have taken place after the budget. That debate was shut down by government. And why was it shut down? Because government could not have a light shone on the fact that their own TDs, particularly Fine Gael TDs from Dublin, reminding them that they had campaigned the last election saying that property taxes were unfair. But because of the usual anomalies in Rush legislation, like gaps identified in the IBRC liquidation process, which have shown that the only bondholders being burned are credit union bondholders and local authority bondholders vis-à-vis unfinished estates. We see it is now necessary to legislate for just causes as identified in the amendments. And I want to again, for the purpose of those who have spoken earlier, reiterate our position in this matter. Yes, on negotiation of the funding provision from the Troika, we did acknowledge that the tax base needed to be widened. We did acknowledge that we had an over-reliance on property-related taxes. And we did commit to the prospect of a site value residential property tax. And what's more, we acknowledged that when we campaigned that this was quite likely. But the public gave us their response. They voted for Fine Gael, whom said any property tax was unfair. They voted Fine Gael because they would immediately, they said, overturn the promissory note deal. They voted Fine Gael because they would get retrospective capitalisation with the banks. They voted Fine Gael because they would overhaul the Troika memos of understanding. They voted Fine Gael because of the 5-point plan. And they voted Labour because bondholders would be burned. They voted Labour because frontline workers would be protected. They voted Labour because education fees wouldn't be raised. And they voted Fine Gael and Labour because they were promised an easier way, a softer way. Closing of the income and expenditure gap would be difficult, but it wouldn't be painful. And you won the election, fair and square, and achieved a massive majority. 2 years later, you now come to realise, of course, that not only, yes, it has been painful, painful for you, painful for your parties, painful for your supporters, but for the electorate, it hasn't just been painful. Many would say it's been torturous. Yes, the gap has been closed further. Yes, the promissory note deal has come 2 years later. There has been no retrospective capitalisation of banks yet. The 5-point plan is now a one-hit wonder. As I said, credit unions and their bondholders have been burned. Local authority bondholders have been burned. Education fees have been raised. The poor in society then are now in poverty. The weak and the disabled have been let down. Frankfurt got a walkover from Labour. And now today, what Enda Kenny said was unfair, what Enda Kenny said was unjust, what Enda Kenny said was illegal, is now about to be enshrined in law and enforced by the Revenue Commissioners. Our commitment on a residential site tax was not predicated on there being no growth or negative growth. It wasn't predicated on the level of negative equity that exists in society today. It wasn't predicated on a mortgage arrears crisis. And it wasn't predicated on there having to be an insufficient insolvency bill that enforces the will and the veto of the banks. The Troika reluctantly accepted this from us and other opposition parties. But they congratulate the government parties who plough on regardless with inequitable property tax and who disregard an inability to pay by fining them another 4%. They plough on regardless with water metering and charges in the absence of promised audit of networks, in the absence of promised audit of costs. And they plough on regardless, as we heard this week, with another charge on properties, in addition to this, in the form of a broadcasting charge on properties. And they plough on regardless, with no regard for what is an archaic commercial rate system that supposedly funds local authorities. They plough on with lame excuses for inaction on upward-only rent reviews. They plough on blindly accepting the trickery of banks that they are lending. And it's against these backdrops that you expect growth, that you expect economic activity, and that you expect jobs to be created. The stark reality is that the promissory note deal will not ease any burden on families. Instead, this property tax will add to the huge burdens on families, will add to the huge burdens on the suffering and the sufferings that families are meeting every day of the week. And as regards the amendments proposed by the government today, yes, I welcome them. But they're a long way short of the demands that will be made by your backbenchers in a few weeks' time, when the revenue drop their demands in the hallways of Ireland. And it's only then, I'm afraid, that you and your parties and your government may realise, only then, that an alternative at this time should have at least been considered and ultimately sought. I don't enjoy making such a prediction. I wish I was wrong, and I wish people could afford this. And I wish our society was in the sort of shape that the Taoiseach tells his peers in Europe. And I sincerely hope, Minister Noonan, you don't regret this. And I sincerely hope that the error and disregard is not your swan song.